I want to now introduce our second speaker, which is Laura Boon, and she is the Lloyd's Register Foundation Public Curator for Contemporary Maritime at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. This museum is now providing a venue for Extinction Rebellion family groups to hold community activities, and she is presenting today and helping us to explore the challenges, understand more about the lessons that have been learnt and the practicalities, as well as their plans for the future. So I will now hand over to Laura.
Thank you very much. So good morning, everybody. My name's Laura, I'm from the National Maritime Museum, and today I'm going to be talking about how we've engaged with protests through rapid collection and rapid response. So since 2018, there's been a huge increase in the amount of public attention on the climate crisis. And this in part has been driven through movements like the school strikes and Extinction Rebellion. This leads to a huge challenge for museums. Museums are always striving to be relevant. Many organisations are wishing to engage more with the climate change crisis, and many of the staff are passionate about this. But how do we engage with organisations that are very grassroots, are rapidly changing, don't really have a traditional form of hierarchy, and are rapidly evolving? At the National Maritime Museum, we explore people's relationship with the ocean, and this is being changed by climate change. We're really keen that we're a place for discussion, we're a place that our community can come together, and also an area for kind of information and people learning more. Now, many of you will work in organisations that have a fairly similar format. The vast majority of objects that we take are of a historical nature. They take over 100 years to enter our collection. A really great example of this is what the museum sometimes refers to as one of our star objects, the jacket that Nelson was wearing when he died. However, this is a really good example of kind of traditional museum collecting. It was kept by family members. It didn't enter the museum for another kind of 100 years. And although in itself it's valuable, it's limited. When we try and explore the kind of bigger story around Nelson and Trafalgar, we know very little about the kind of very ordinary people. And I think this is something that museums are becoming more and more aware of. And when we try and tell a more global story, we're very much limited to an infographic. We know that there was a diverse range of nationalities, but we know very little about them. And I think it's really important that as a contemporary curator, I learn from this, that it's really important when I'm looking at contemporary collecting, that I'm not just thinking about how do I collect and communicate to the kind of our contemporary audiences and our audiences now, which is sometimes the risk when we engage with contemporary audiences, but also what are we communicating to the future? Am I building up a historical record for the future? We live in an increasingly kind of materialistic and consumerist society. Much of what we use day to day is mass produced, and it's also meant to be disposable. Very little is designed to be kind of kept as keepsakes or even kind of repaired and handed down. I mean, I think as museums, we have to identify this as being a really big risk. A very different form of protest to the climate protests was the protests and political engagement around the EU Leave campaign. But it does serve as a warning to us. There's a political campaign group called Fishing for Leave, who campaign around kind of fishing rights and the idea that when we leave the EU, there'll be huge kind of economic and social benefits through increased fishing rights. Interestingly, the pub chain Wetherspoons produced 250,000 beer mats in the run-up to the vote that kind of showed the Fishing for Leave manifesto and views. What's really interesting is just a few years later, there's now only a handful of these beer mats in existence. So what was actually a very kind of widespread piece of political campaign suddenly disappears. And you'd expect this, beer mats are by their very nature meant to be disposable. However, it should make us aware that if we don't collect these things now, they're not going to be available in the future. Now, Extinction Rebellion, many of you will be familiar with, and I think it was also discussed yesterday. But it has very quickly formed into a very large global organisation. It was formed in May 2018, and by the Easter of May 2019, we saw these huge scenes in London. There was 5 key points of London blocked, hundreds of thousands of people protesting, and over 1,000 arrests. These tactics at the time, although we're now quite familiar with them, did seem quite kind of shocking. They have been quite divisive, and it's worth mentioning that Extinction Rebellion kind of remains quite a kind of hot topic. Some people hate it, some people love it, but it's inarguable that they've really moved on discussion around the climate crisis. Pre this event, they were already on my radar, and I was trying to get in contact with them, but by their very nature, they're not really set up to engage with museums. At this point, they were rapidly increasing and forming. It was lots of volunteers, so they weren't really set up to engage with museums. They weren't beginning to think about their legacy. So in Easter 2019, and many of you remember the scenes, the pink boat appeared. So named after Berta, an environmental campaigner in Honduras, and the boat was used to block the main shopping route in Oxford Circus for a number of days. Once the boat was removed by the police, the symbol of the boat continued, with people wearing boat hats. We had lots of signs with people saying, "I am the boat," and it became a kind of well-known symbol of the movement worldwide. At this point, I was trying to get in contact with the organisation, but again, they weren't set up with it. And I think it's really important, if people want to do this kind of thing, is my first advice would be perseverance. So I sent quite a wide number of emails to different people, and it took a little while for us to get in contact with them. However, a couple of weeks after the action, we began discussions with Extinction Rebellion, and we very much went in with our kind of eyes open. We didn't go with a checklist of this is exactly what we want to do. We wanted to talk to Extinction Rebellion. We wanted to find out kind of their motivations and their aims, and we wanted to see, well, actually, how does this work for us as a museum? And I think through talking from Extinction Rebellion, obviously we felt that this was relevant to the museum, but we discovered that we actually had a lot more kind of shared aims than we were perhaps expecting. Many of the people in Extinction Rebellion are driven through a concern for the ocean and the kind of damage that we are doing to it. And these are goals that are shared with the museum. The boat itself had been seized by the police and was being held as kind of evidence of a criminal act. However, early discussions with Extinction Rebellion suggested that it might be that the police would be willing to release it to the museum. Obviously, it's quite expensive to long store a boat, and they were quite keen to get rid of it, we were told. However, this was one of the kind of first challenges with working with Extinction Rebellion. They generally don't acknowledge ownership of individual items. So the boat belonged to the organisation. However, from a legal point of view, one person would have to claim ownership of it in order for it to be released to us. The individual in question was willing to do this. However, around the same time, led by some very negative press articles about the police being too soft to Extinction Rebellion, there began to be a kind of change in police tactics. And it seemed that actually if the individual did try and claim the boat, that the penalty towards them would be much more stringent. There was a risk that this individual would be kind of held up as an example. This is obviously a very complex ethical and legal kind of issue, and one that could fill much longer than my time today. But basically, we all took the mutual decision that we wouldn't go forward with trying to collect the pink boat. I think it's really important to be honest at this point and say that I failed. My aim was to collect the pink boat, and it didn't happen. There'd been museum time spent on this, and as you can expect, it was quite a contentious issue within the museum about whether or not this was suitable for us. We'd even begun some of the design work, but actually it didn't come to pass. But I think what's really important is that we learned. So this one didn't happen, but it meant as an organisation we really challenged ourselves. We challenged colleagues all across the board to look and say, well, as a maritime museum, how is climate change relevant for us? As a maritime museum, how is protest around this relevant to us? And as a museum, how do we engage with what is intrinsically a political organisation? So jump forward to the summer protest that happened a few months later, and suddenly there was 5 more very colourful boats all across the UK. In London, we had the blue Polly Higgins boat that was originally put outside the Royal Courts of Justice. And its main focus was around making ecocide law. Around the Wednesday of the protest, I had a phone call from my contact asking if the museum might be interested in displaying the boat short term. At this point, Extinction Rebellion weren't interested in kind of donating the boat to us for permanent, because for them it was still a useful object, it was still a living object. This was the beginning of its history and its use for the Extinction Rebellion, and they didn't want it to effectively kind of end its life up in a museum. Likewise, looking at our collection policy, something that often surprises people is that the Maritime Museum no longer actively collects boats, and this is mainly for a storage reason. So at this point, we weren't looking at kind of acquiring anything. It was just going to be a short-term display. As is often the case, we thought that we had a little bit more time than we did. So the idea was that the boat would go into storage. We'd maybe have 2 to 3 weeks to get ourselves ready, get the interpretation ready, and then the boat would collect it and display it, which was a time frame that would be very tight for the museum, but there was something that we were comfortable with. On the Friday, in the early hours of the morning, I had a slightly panicked phone call asking if we could possibly take the boat that day. At around 7 AM, the police had passed a Section 12 against Extinction Rebellion, specifically restricting the use of boats and anything kind of any large structures. So their plans to use the boat as part of the school strikes later that day had become completely illegal. The boat was parked outside the Old Vic, and there was a situation that the museum basically had to take it that day, or it would once again be confiscated by the police, and it was unlikely that we would ever be able to kind of access it. I feel like there's probably never a good day to go to your heads of departments and directors and say, this is the new plan, can we make it work? But unfortunately, the day before, the museum had opened its new kind of blockbuster exhibition. There was quite a lot of exhausted staff, especially in the exhibition team, but we had an emergency meeting around 10 AM. By 12, I was outside the Old Vic with one of my conservation colleagues, checking the boat for asbestos and to check that it was safe to travel on its trailer. And then some slightly surreal discussions began with the police about whether or not they would let us move the boat. And it was surrounded by kind of a ring of policemen, some CCTV kind of mobile cameras. And at first, I think the police were slightly cynical that this was some sort of bizarre ruse. Eventually, we managed to kind of get permission to move the boat. However, it was under the conditions that we would have a full police escort all the way back to the museum, which was over an hour in rush hour traffic. And that also would take a slightly longer route so that we wouldn't go past any key London landmarks. And then the hard work started. So we tarped up the boat and put it into storage. And then 19 days later, we popped it on display. So normally a display of this size would take the museum around kind of at least 6 months to put in display, and we did it in 19 days. We had the advantage that we still had some of the kind of design ideas from the pink boat, but we obviously worked really hard. Lots of colleagues took on kind of slightly different roles than they normally would in order to get this together. It was also really important to us when displaying the boat that we followed the ethos of Extinction Rebellion. As we're all aware, museum exhibitions are generally extremely unsustainable. We use a lot of artificial materials, and it's generally up for a short time, and then it all ends up disposed of. So we tried to think about how we could make sure that we used as much kind of reusable materials as possible. We made sure that we thought really hard about what was the best materials that could be reused. So for example, we didn't use wooden stakes for the fencing because there was a high chance that this they would rot during the display and then would bin them. So instead we used metal that we painted in the Extinction Rebellion colours. But this is the type of metal that our works team use a lot. So we knew that once the exhibition was done, we'd be able to reuse these panels, and that's what's happened. For all of the interpretation panels, we just took old panels, basically from a skip, repainted them, again in the kind of Extinction Rebellion colours, and to look a little bit like protest signs. And then finally, instead of using plastic roping for the fence, we used a natural twine that could be composted, and actually that was reused when it was time for it to leave to wrap up the tarp. So it means for this display there was no materials that weren't kind of reused in some form from later, which is great. Like lots of you, I've spent quite a lot of my life in a museum doing gallery observations, and I've always noticed that people will generally kind of scan the first paragraph. They'll begin reading the introduction, but a lot of people actually, they don't read all of it. And from my observations of the boat, I was actually really surprised at how much people wanted to read the interpretation. And one of my very smart colleagues in interpretation suggested that we still had a very traditional kind of museum text panel that just introduced it as a lone object, which is the white panel that you can currently see on screen. And this worked surprisingly well, having the kind of more traditional museum voice and then our interpretation. One of the kind of main questions I heard people asking as they walked up to the boat was, is it the real one or is it a fake? So it was quite useful actually, having it clearly written which boat it was and how it was used, and that it was definitely the real kind of Extinction Rebellion one. We also made sure that we had kind of practical things that people could do if they wanted to take action. So we had the 7 R's, reduce, etc. And we found that this is really important. When we're telling people about issues like climate change, they want to feel that there's practical action that they can take as an individual. Something that I'm sometimes asked is, in regards to the text, was it kind of co-creation with Extinction Rebellion? And actually in this case, we took the decision that as a national museum, we couldn't be seen as a platform for Extinction Rebellion. So they didn't actually have any kind of editing rights over the text, although we did enable them to kind of fact check it before it went up. I think one of the kind of things that I underestimated going into this project was just how time consuming all the stakeholder management was, both in the run up but also after installation. Extinction Rebellion, by its very nature, is a kind of non-hierarchical organization. There's also lots of individual groups within it, and then there's also related organizations. As I said, the boat is named after Polly Higgins, who was an environmental lawyer and campaigner who unfortunately had died just a few months prior. So it was really important that with her friends and family that we made sure that they were comfortable with the way that we were talking about Polly. And for them, it was really important that we talked not just about her life, but also her ongoing legacy. Now, as I said, we decided not to try and acquire the boat. The plan was that it was going to keep being used. But the more we spoke with Extinction Rebellion, the more we learned that actually their flags had a really kind of fitting place within their collection. So we acquired all of the 10 flags that you can see kind of flying on the boat, as well as an additional 3 from their marine collection. So these are the flags that focus on kind of marine species under threat. The other area that we were limited in collection was oral histories. So normally for such a big project, we would have wanted to have some oral histories around the boat, but because it wouldn't have been possible to talk about the blue boat without the pink boat, and this would really require people to talk about illegal activity, we took the decision that it wasn't possible to take oral histories. So I think when we're engaging with Extinction Rebellion or similar organizations, we just need to really think through these kinds of processes and limitations. So as you can see, the boat was kind of right outside the main entrance of the museum on what is normally a fairly unloved piece of lawn. However, while the boat was there, it became a gathering point. We had groups of Extinction Rebellion, including one of the founders, Gail, come and do some speeches, followed by a die-in. And I think it's fair to say that this was very much outside of the museum's comfort zone, especially for some of our front of house staff. But I think what was really important was that by hosting Extinction Rebellion, it gave members of our staff the opportunity to kind of really talk to them and realize that actually these are ordinary people, they're members of our community, and that we kind of share many of the same concerns and aspirations as them. It's worth saying that although I say we hosted Extinction Rebellion, we were kind of given a day and a time that they were going to turn up, which I think generally a museum likes to have a little bit more control. But I think that's one of the main learning points, is that we don't need that level of control. And it's making sure that our museum spaces are open and welcoming. With Extinction Rebellion families, we had a similar situation. They popped us an email saying, we'd like to come in, is that okay? And we said yes. And because this was aimed at Extinction Rebellion families with a very kind of young average age of the participants, they changed it into a love-in. And this was actually a really kind of positive, happy event. We had kind of over 100 people there having a shared picnic lunch. They then put on lots of kind of craft activities. And I remember watching from a distance, and actually it was great. They were putting on lots of the similar engagement activities as the museum might, but it was completely organised by the community. It's completely open. And I think this presents a really interesting model for how we should enable our spaces to be used. These should be public spaces that people should feel able to and feel supported in using. Later in the year, once the boat had gone, we then also had a toy swap in the run-up to Christmas, once again completely organised by XR families. I think what was most surprising about the display of the boat was not just that the Extinction Rebellion group started to use the space, but also kind of associated organisations started to see this as a public gathering space. So during the climate strikes, we had a group from the University of Greenwich use it as a gathering spot. And we also had a local community group who were protesting the Silvertown Tunnel use it. What was really interesting about this was that there was no kind of prior communication with the museum. In some cases, we'd find out that these groups had been to the museum via things like Twitter or our security team. But I think that this is great. I think people kind of seeing the museum's grounds rather than private property is how it should be. These should be places that belong to our community. So quickly to just look at a few things that we've learned from this process. I think going forward, this worked really well for the museum. But as I said, it put quite a lot of pressure on some members of the museum to get it done in a really kind of short space of time. And the photo on the screen is a great example. On the day when we were installing and getting the slightly bent mast up, we literally had a fairly large number of the team involved from various different departments. Going forward, if the museum wants to do this more regularly, there's the challenge about how do we have this kind of flexibility within people's kind of work schedules, that we can do this in a way that doesn't put kind of unnecessary pressure on the team. We currently have a working group that's looking at, do we create a physical space within the museum that's much more suited for rapid display? Although we're still very committed to looking at how we can continue to use our outdoor spaces to host things like this. I think the engagement that we've had with groups like XR Families has shown us that we should be more generous with our spaces, and that actually we should be willing to give up much more kind of control to them. And I think it's also identified kind of the restrictions of our collecting policy. So although we now have the flags in the collection, as they're now collection items, it's quite restricted how we use them. So for example, can they once again go outside in the grounds? And the answer is probably not. So we're looking at ways that actually we can make sure that once we acquire something into the national collection, it can be used more. Obviously, the current situation we're in is very different. And collecting and engaging with Extinction Rebellion during COVID has been much more of a challenge. And likewise, the furlough scheme, although great for the museum's finances, means that we've been in a much lower capacity. So doing additional kind of large scale projects at the moment isn't really possible. However, I think it's really important that we continue to find ways to engage with Extinction Rebellion. They've also now just formed a kind of sister organisation of Ocean Rebellion, and that the museum kind of learns from this experience and continues to be brave. So thank you very much. I'm willing to share my email if anyone has any additional questions, and we've also got a questions session after the next panel. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Laura. We have had a question pop up. I made a note of it and I'm going to save it for later. I just think you've really clearly laid out some of the challenges actually posed by our traditional ways of working in museums when we're faced with representing these themes and issues, especially when they're new to us. And I was just quite struck by the extent to which that can actually be a barrier to successfully driving change without limiting the scale of our ambitions. So I was really pleased at the end to hear how you're working on that. And I suppose I'm hopeful that the wider sector could potentially benefit from the work that you're doing, and maybe we could stay in touch on that front.
Perfect, yeah. And I think as well as the museum learning, one of the things that I really didn't expect was that for many people in Extinction Rebellion, they saw us as the establishment, which I personally wouldn't expect, and I think it took me a while to twig onto that. But I think it was that kind of mutual trust, and now that's kind of spread, and it means we can be kind of introduced by other people, and it was then building that trust in us as well, that we were kind of, it's definitely like a two-way relationship.
Thank you. Well, as I say, we've got the Q&A later. We're now moving to a break. Great. So you do have the Q&A function. And if we don't get to your question, we are recording them and we'll post responses. I suppose I had a couple of questions thinking about both of your presentations, and I want to come to Laura first. And we started to talk about this a little bit before the break in terms of the challenges you were posing with regards to the traditional museum approach to collection policies. And I suppose I was interested to know a little bit more about what you feel we can do in that area so that we're not limiting the scale of our ambition, but also how that then maybe relates to things like our accreditation standard and where your thoughts are moving in terms of that.
Yeah, of course. So to unpack that a little bit, I guess sometimes, especially being in as big an organisation as Royal Museums Greenwich, there's the kind of accreditation rules, but then there's also the museum rules, which sometimes are slightly informal, or they've been formed over a number of years. And when we displayed the boat, I'd only been at the museum for around 6 months, so I was still kind of finding my way a little bit. So I think a key thing is really getting the kind of collection management and the conservation team as much on side as possible, because sometimes that can be very helpful in finding solutions. And if people feel like you're trying to improve things overall rather than just trying to force through your one project, that can sometimes be helpful. Something that has sometimes occurred at the museum is that we don't acquire objects, we instead take them as property of the museum. And this has the benefits that you then can display them in slightly more kind of open display methods. And the boat, we didn't have it in the usual formal loan agreement that would have meant that we basically had to give it back in the exact same condition. We realised that we were having it outside for several months in the English weather, and that it was likely that deterioration would occur. So I think it is being realistic, and I don't think as a museum we found the solutions yet. It's something that we're kind of still struggling with, but it needs to be a whole museum discussion about actually this is what we want to do. But I think it's important that if there are objects that we're wanting to ensure have kind of as much community access as possible, that we still do try and acquire them. Sometimes in the past things have come into museums as kind of learning objects or handling objects, and then generally they're not treated with the same level of care, or someone leaves and that object gets lost in the back of a cupboard somewhere. So yeah, I think it is something that we're currently struggling with, but it's something that our director, who's fairly new to the museum, is very keen at actually is finding a way that we keep within the accreditation, but that we can still actually use the flags and display the flags. So it's something that we're working on. And we do, as a museum, we've just been working on a new content strategy, because we're finding that perhaps the old research strategy doesn't necessarily fit some contemporary topics.
Thank you. Laura, there's a specific question about your collaboration with Extinction Rebellion families in terms of the activities that were devised, and just whether that was led by them or developed by the museum, and how you approached that.
The way that we approached it for the Love-In was that they completely developed it. So they contacted us and said that they'd like to come in on a certain day. It was over the half term. They gave us times that they'd like to arrive, the space that they wanted to use, and kind of gave us a rough outline of what they were planning to do. And to be honest, we had a fairly hands-off approach. The main restriction we gave to them was just asking that they didn't block any fire escapes, and that making sure that they knew who in the front of house was their key contact, so that if there was any problems. So we did very much leave them to it. The toy swap, which was in the run up to Christmas, we had a little bit more kind of engagement with them, because they were kind of using us a little bit like you might use a kind of village hall, or they needed some space, and they needed some rooms, they needed some tables. So that one we had a little bit more feed in, but again we very much let them lead it, we let them advertise it. they were very much running it. The only restriction we gave, I think, was that they wanted to have food and drink, but on like a donation system, and unfortunately that wasn't possible. And also, as a museum, we can't let people don't take donations in general for other organizations. So that was the one restriction that we gave to them, but otherwise, again, it was just making sure that they had the support that they needed, but we didn't try and dictate the activities that they were running. We have looked at running more formal events with them. So we had a talk about how do you talk to your children about climate change. And that was obviously going to be more of a kind of led event with child psychologists. And so that one, it was a kind of collaboration. And likewise, we've been looking at running activities where it might be that they do the kind of screen printing, especially we would do another display with them, in which case we would kind of collaborate and organize it a little bit more in the kind of traditional freelance model. And if we see that, it's important to say that we would be looking to pay them within our freelancer scheme, because I think that's an important thing to say, that often museums could expect people to give their time for free, but actually if they've got a skill and an expertise that we want, just because they hold kind of high values and that's why they're doing it, we shouldn't expect them to kind of give their time and their resources for free.
Thank you.